it hurt the post. I think being too vague, it hurt the post. I think like not like having a human connection was important. I think that's a cool thing that indies have that like a AAA company can't really do is like you're like a friend next door making a game. You're not a company with a PR department trying to market a game. And that gets people excited. Like people put themselves in your shoes. It's like, oh, he made a game. That's my dream is to make a game like he did. And they kind of want to celebrate with you too. And that's what happened, I noticed, was like just being human. Like I think saying like, this is like my dream, because it was like to see my game on Nintendo Switch. And it got people excited and they wanted to celebrate with you. So yeah, I would say the human connection is most important. Thanks. Thanks. Thank you everybody, appreciate it.
Not really, not even. No. А я этот художник, верю. Что такое?
Hey there, how's it going? Yes, another game jam. If you're into game dev here on YouTube, or you've watched some of my other dev vlogs, you may know the YouTuber Mrs. He makes great videos, courses, streams, has a podcast, and comes up with some really interesting ways for people to make games. I absolutely love the 4 Game Devs Jam off the same Art Kit series, and I was lucky enough to take part in it myself. So when Miz contacted me about a small experimental game jam, I was in without question. So here's the concept. It's called the Chain Letter Jam. Chain letters have existed in some form for a long time. Apparently since like 1935, dang. I remember them best from the late 90s, early 2000s, where there seemed to be a resurgence in them as society began to mass adopt email. You'd receive a message that would have an image or something like that, and it would say you had to forward this letter to X number of people in some amount of time or else you die. To this day, they're still just as annoying as ever. I still see them fairly frequently on Discord servers, although nowadays they seem to drop the you'll die part. Luckily, that's not a component of this jam. For this, the concept is that each link in the chain will be a game designer and game that will ever be expanding out. In the basic of terms, link 1 is the game that Miz made. They then post their game and nominate a number of other people. Those designers then need to make a roughly 1 minute long game that's inspired by the ones they were nominated by. This all has a bit of the old telephone game in it as well, where each step of the chain, the product will mutate as different designers pull different elements that they would use as their inspiration. I absolutely love this idea, and I'm really honored to be among those in the second link of the chain. So here's the game I was sent. To get started, I checked it out and broke it down live on my Twitch stream to see what I had to work with as our quote-unquote theme, I guess is how you call it. Wordman saves the day. We get a quick cutscene and the story that Dr. Letters is going to destroy the world and Wordman cannot let that happen. We play as Wordman and must evade the bullet hell of Letters to survive. You can left-click on the letters to try and create words. When you have a word made, you can right-click to deal damage based on the length of that word to Dr. Letters. But you have to be fast, because if your letters hit the wall, your word is now messed up and you can't use it anymore. And like a standard boss fight, when you've dealt enough damage, it's super cute. You could win with doing 2 and 3 letter words, but it's really fun to see how long of a word you can make. Also, as you can see, it lets you show how much you're equal. How do I take this as a base and make something that's similar, but also my own? I began by writing out all the core elements that I wanted to consider. I then identified what elements I wanted to keep and what I was going to change to make my interpretation. I started off by mixing it up quite a bit by switching from a top-down game perspective and moving it over into a platform. I also, pretty early on, decided that I wasn't going to have
What if I told you that you can target the exact person that you're looking for? The dream client that you're chasing?
I recently unearthed an old backup drive from the year 2010. Curious to see what treasures it contained, I plugged it in and switched it on. Ah, yes, I was 12 years old and creating a film called The Great Museum Robbery. That didn't get very far, so I began experimenting with stop motion instead, inspired mainly by the wrong trousers. With a lot of help from my mother and one of my friends, I made a little 2-minute short about a ball which sprouts legs and runs away. Bad as the animation is, it still took an eternity to complete, so out of laziness I began learning how to animate on the computer, which allowed me to turn my terrible ideas into terrible results at an unprecedented rate. Now, animating was a lot of fun, but my obsession at the time was a little game called RuneScape. I played this for hours and hours and hours on end, and even made several music videos, which were very cool. This for hours and called RuneScape. I played this for hours and hours and hours on end, and even made several music videos, which were very cool. I was particularly fascinated though on the rare occasion when something broke. This felt like a glimpse behind the curtains, and it made me want to know more. I'd heard whispers that games were made using something called scripting, and so one day I searched my computer for that mysterious term, and came across something called the script editor. I remember typing some characters in and being really excited to find out what would happen when I ran it. Of course, all that happened was I got my first syntax error message. After a bit of searching online though, I was amazed to discover that AppleScript was mostly like writing in English, and I learned first how to display a dialog box, and then how to make the computer say stuff.
I'm a virus mover,
which I found endlessly entertaining. After a while, I was ready to create my first game, Speed Reactions. So in this game, you have 1 second to press the correct button. Let's go. Left. Wow, I wasn't fast enough. Okay. Left. Boom. Gym. Back. Too difficult for me. Press cancel to quit. That's normal. So I made a bunch of these little experiments in games with AppleScript, the most advanced probably being Hangman. But the AppleScript language is intended for automating tasks, not so much for developing games, and I started to get bored of everything taking place in these dialog boxes. It was a pretty good introduction to programming though. Here is the Hangman script, for example, and you can see it's got all the fundamentals like loops and if statements, variables, functions, and so on. By now I'd learned that RuneScape was created with Java, so of course that's what I wanted to learn. My first Java game was Noughts and Crosses, which I created with what I learned by reading some of the chapters of a book called Teach Yourself Java in 21 Days. I must have skipped some of the important ones though, judging by the horrors I found in the code, like an AI class containing 800 lines of painstakingly coded if-else logic. Thankfully I was saved from inevitable insanity by a student from the local university who my dad enlisted to give me a few one-on-one lessons. With his guidance I created my most elaborate game yet, the Ninja Test. There are a couple of different mini-games, but the fanciest is Pong, where you need to survive as long as possible against an apparently unbeatable opponent. The fanciest thing is that the computer player calculates the trajectory of the ball and moves directly to the predicted location. Pretty impressive. I take it all back, it's garbage. The next thing I wanted to learn was 3D modeling so that I could create 3D games. My first model was this aircraft with a very strangely shaped rear end. I followed up that masterpiece with a wine bottle and then a rifle.
Сам такой дурак. Сам дурак, дурное влияние. Ну, хорошо. Пошел в университет. Жизнь дай Бог. И тебе так говоришь, тебе так говоришь. Какой Бог правильный. Траектория. Не стыдно. Стыдно.
I just love the texture work on this model, especially on the back part, because it's so clearly a picture of some floorboards. I kept at it though, gradually attempting more and more complex subjects. Here's my first attempt at a human, and an attempt at sculpting his head. This man has seen things. I learnt a lot from following CG cookie tutorials, like this one on creating a character called Kara. As you can see, she remained headless, and to this day, I still can't make heads. Something for the next decade, perhaps. I also made some strange little animations, like this one about a dysfunctional vending machine in the desert, especially on the back part, because it's so clearly a picture of some floorboards. I kept at it though, gradually attempting more and more complex subjects. Here's my first attempt at a human, and an attempt at sculpting his head. This man has seen things. I learnt a lot from following CG cookie tutorials, like this one on creating a character called Kara. As you can see, she remained headless, and to this day, I still can't make heads. Something for the next decade, perhaps. I also made some strange little animations, like this one about a dysfunctional vending machine in the desert, or this one about a mannequin trying to make friends with a robot he discovers in an old warehouse. Robot he discovers in an old warehouse. During this time, I experimented with a number of different game engines, but I had a really hard time understanding them. Finally, in mid-2012, I came across the Unity engine and followed a tutorial by 3D Buzz on creating a little space shooter. From this, I learned many of the fundamentals, like player input and movement, collision detection, and instantiating and destroying objects. The programming is done in C#, but since that's so similar to Java, I was able to create my second game without the help of a tutorial. By this time I was really into Call of Duty, and so I started work on my epic zombie survival game. I made some little devlog videos for this, which were some of the first videos uploaded to my channel. Hardly anyone was watching them though, which was a problem because I needed to get people excited about it so they'd buy it when it was done, and at 13 I didn't exactly have a huge marketing budget. So I decided to lure people to my channel with tutorials. The only problem is that I was very self-conscious about my voice, so I pitched the audio down several levels to sound more manly.
Hey guys, welcome to this Unity tutorial on how to create a Zelda-style health bar.
The video was about 30 minutes long and contained nuggets of wisdom like...
So when we start scripting, we need to think about what does the script need to be able to do.
You heard it here first, folks. The tutorial did actually get a fair number of views, but I then abandoned the zombie game because the code was a horrifying mess and everything kept breaking. Instead, I started this new project in 2013, where you have to build out your base and use different weapons and so on to survive against hordes of invading aliens. If I've ever been consistent on something though, it's not finishing what I start, and so I soon moved on to creating a slew of similarly unfinished titles. To be fair though, I do think that creating loads of little prototypes like this is a pretty good way of learning. Towards the end of 2013, I entered a challenge to finish a game and try earn at least $1 from it. So I spent the month making May the Best Man Win, a pretty unremarkable tower defense game where you compete to be the best man at your best friend's wedding. I put it up for sale and was over the moon when several nice people actually bought it, making it the first money I ever earned from game development.
Next up, Last Chance Supermarket.
This was a game I made for a 48-hour game jam called Ludum Dare. Essentially, you need to rush around with your shopping cart and get everything on your Christmas list, while also trying not to crash into the other frenzied shoppers. This was perhaps the first game I made that was actually fun to play, and I was super proud of it and made a whole behind-the-scenes video about my process of creating it. It went on to win first place in the fun category of the competition, and also enjoyed a brief moment in the limelight after it was played by a certain Swedish gentleman.
Well, that game's pretty cool, I like it.
Well, I clearly peaked in 2014, so I'm afraid it's all downhill from here. Infection was my first time collaborating on a project. I teamed up with Daniel, who did the art, and later on Tiago, who made music, and together we worked on a number of little games, like This Little Piggy, which is a game about making potato salad. By this time it was 2015, my second last year of high school, and in that year everyone has to pick a project to work on for about 6 months, and then present it to the school. I chose to start creating tutorials again, so I bought a microphone with a bit of money I'd made from the supermarket game, and started creating animated diagrams for my first tutorial on the A-star pathfinding algorithm. I followed that up with a series on modeling, rigging, and animating a character in Blender, and then creating a 2D platformer controller, and finally procedurally generating caves with cellular automata. I enjoyed working on these so much that once I finished high school I decided not to go study but just keep making videos. I was already earning some money from ad revenue and occasional freelancing, and I also then started a Patreon page where people have been incredibly generous in supporting my work. So in the past few years I've been much more focused on creating tutorials than games, but I did find some time to work on some small projects like Spirit Rover, a game where you have to write instructions to send to a little Mars rover called Spirit in order to guide it through the treacherous terrain. Or Splotch, made with my friend Liam, where you have to draw lines to try bounce a ball around obstacles and into its gate as quickly as possible. Then there was also Swordfish, a game about hacking, but in a very Hollywood action movie kind of way. In this last year though, I've been trying something a little different, which is to take a topic that I think is interesting and spend a couple of weeks to a month researching and playing around with it. And then, unlike with my usual tutorials where I just show step by step how to create it, I've been trying to show more of the entire process, so the initial experiments, as well as the bugs and roadblocks I faced, and the random little tangents along the way. I've been having a lot of fun with this series, especially because it's given me the freedom to tackle things that are a little bit out of my league. For example, Clouds was a recent project I undertook, and I couldn't really make a tutorial on it because I wasn't able to get it to run fast enough to be usable in an actual game. But I think it's still made for a pretty interesting coding adventure video. Well, in a nutshell, it's been my first 10 years of learning programming and game development and of creating YouTube videos. It's been hugely motivating to have so many people actually watching and responding to the videos, so thank you all for that. And an extra huge thanks, of course, to those who've been supporting me in all of this on Patreon. It's been an interesting 10 years for me, with lots of weird projects ranging from being a fly trying to get up someone's nose, to creating a terrible little console to play Snake on. So I'm curious to see what the next decade has in store. Thanks for watching. Cheers.
En analysant les parcours des entrepreneurs qui semblent réussir, on cherche à les imiter. On fait l'erreur de ne pas analyser tous les autres qui ont suivi la même stratégie, mais qui n'ont jamais eu de résultat.
So I've been making video games for around 10.
This is a video about things, like cars, phones, and light bulbs, and an actual conspiracy that made them worse. This video is sponsored by NordVPN. More about them at the end of the video. I am outside Livermore Fire Station number 6, and in here they have the longest continuously on light bulb in the world. It has been on for 120 years.
En analysant les parcours des entrepreneurs,
This video is made possible by my game bundle. Play 7 awesome games and help support the channel. Get the Steam Game Bundle at unitycodemonkey.com/gamebundle. In this video, I'm going to talk about my indie game developer journey, how I got started making chat games 20 years ago, then moved on to Flash and eventually got to Unity. Through all that, I made over 40 games and learned a ton along the way, which I'm now sharing in these videos. Let's begin! Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey, and this channel is all about helping you learn how to make your own games with in-app tutorials made by a professional indie game developer. So if you find the video helpful, consider subscribing. Alright, so here I will cover my entire game dev journey over these past 20 years. How I got started making chat games, then moved on to Flash, and finally to Unity. Over all that time, I've made over 40 games and learned a ton. This video took a real long time to put together with writing and editing, so if you can, please hit the like button and share it with a friend. Most of my Steam games are included in the game bundle, which you can pick up on the website. This video is made possible thanks to these awesome supporters. Go to patreon.com/unitycodemonkey to get some perks and help keep the videos free for everyone. My game dev journey started quite a very long time ago. I've been making games using Unity since 2012. Before that, I made games with Flash since 2008. And before that, I was experimenting with programming, making all kinds of games since I was about 10. I started learning programming by modding Mirk, which was a very nice and simple IRC chat client. It was a great way to get started learning the basics of programming and logic. It was mostly limited to text, but the code was real, and I found it fascinating to write code to tell a machine what to do. Eventually, I did a bunch of chat games like Trivia, Hangman, Guess the Number, and so on. So very simple stuff, but it was enough to get me started on the idea of interactivity. Over time, I was also interested in movies and animation, so eventually I found my way into Flash. It was the best program to draw and animate things. It was frame-by-frame animation, which is a very laborious way of animating, but also extremely intuitive.
Les gens essaient souvent de changer leur monde tout en restant les mêmes. Ce n'est pas possible. Vous pouvez obtenir des choses dans votre vie grâce à une manipulation mentale, mais vous ne pourrez les conserver qu'en élargissant votre conscience et en vous permettant de vous épanouir et d'évoluer.
Intuitive. You just draw one frame, then move the character a bit in the next frame, and so on. So as I was doing that, it didn't take too long to see how I could also write code in Flash. So at that point, my brain clicked, and I
Ну и там, где денег нету, как бы говорят, да, там где про деньги, кстати, ну да, понимаешь, это, ну как минимум вранье. Да, очень всякие штучки. Ничего бесплатного не бывает, я не понимаю, нельзя так говорить, ну да, нет, ну не бесплатно, потому что это все это потому что как минимум это труд человеческий, то есть не бесплатно, потому что ты, как тебе объяснить, что все продуктами все является продуктами, да. Да заткнись уже с этой кретинией, да, достал. Ну да. Ничего не, бесплатно не бывает ничего, да, кредит как бы. Ну типа того, ну да. Вот, ну это условно они так говорят. То есть зачем тебе выпускать бесплатный продукт, бесплатную игру, для чего, с какой целью ты будешь делать, ну понимаешь. Чтобы это ревеню получать, да, для опыта, да, я помню, да, для того, чтобы потом получить деньги, чтобы занять свое место в обществе, где тебе будут платить деньги. И, да, нет, деньги отдельно, а слава отдельно, да. Известность, так скажем, да. Нет, я не в обиду говорю, то есть. А почему так брезгуешь, что деньгами? Давай тогда тебя убьем, расчленим, если без денег, тогда значит, то есть как бы деньги это твое тело. Нет, здоровье и тело это разные вещи. Да. Не совпадают со здоровьем. Ну, это имеется в виду. Ну, да. Ну, ты про себя говоришь. Ну, и что ты имеешь в виду? Ну, да, нет. То есть, может так, вот это имеет в виду, что надо ухаживать за ним, понял. Даже смотри, это не важно, по-любому, но все равно тебе даже, ничего ты будешь делать, понял. То есть, как бы все равно один и тот же. Я вот и говорю, все это нечистые люди, которые говорят там без денег, бесплатно, как бы, да. Я не про себя тебе говорю, блин. Да, это всякие духовности, всякого там бытового, да, бесплатные Кораны раздают, которые там очень. Ну, короче, долгая история, да. Ну, да. Ну, это просто на скорую руку. Да. Я не понимаю, что такое благотворительность. Да, я понимаю, что всем людям надо работать, а ты ему даешь деньги задарма. Да. Ты делов не знаешь. Нет, женщина я вообще не в счет, я их не беру в счет, потому что женщина не мужчина, в смысле. Это плохо, да. Ну, какое дело? Я тебе просто объясняю. Я говорю про мужчин. Да, потом ты поймешь, что это не важно. Да. То есть, да. То есть эти люди, которым ты даешь что-то там, они должны сами себя поднять, вот они сами как автономные, они сами себя должны найти, скажем так, то есть так, реализовать его, да, как-то так. Это их уже проблема, как они так не делают. Да. Типа того. Потому что это неплохо и нехорошо, просто так оно и есть. тогда будет специалистов с копейки, без всего то есть сегодня. Да. И они тебе то же самое скажут, в принципе. Да. Ну, самый лучший вариант это все равно, то есть это вариант, когда им что-то надо. Да, то есть, когда они жить хотят бы даже. Да не важно. Ну, не важно, да. То есть я поэтому благотворительности я не верю, понимаешь? Потому что у нас дармоедов, да, ты понимаешь. Да. Это воровство, потому что, да. Это воровство, да, то есть воровство и у себя самого воровство, потому что ты должна другими делами заниматься. Да. Карпа твоя, я понимаю. Еще как еще, да. То здоровье, всем здоровье. Такого не бывает. Это мужской вопрос, как делать бизнес с нищетой, понимаешь? Чтобы эта нищета как бы тебе помогала, понимаешь? Ты с ней делаешь бизнес, чтобы они тоже были бизнесом, чтобы не твое было. Такие времена были, когда у тебя были рабы, которые нищие, и попирал. Но они проходят, потому что рабы это не вот это животные, они твои рабы. Ты берешь и пасешь их, просто не животное просто. Но это не говорит тоже о том, что это очень хорошо. Я просто говорю как бы факт. Оказалось, что негры не животные, например. Да, вот я понял, да. Это уже просто программирование там да, ну, так уж, да. Ну просто долгое программирование, я понял. Да. Что и крестьяне, не живут, то есть как бы, да. Они даже могут притворяться, что они живут, все равно они не живут. И кровь у них одинаковая, такая, как у тебя, да. Ну да, я понимаю. Ну типа они тоже все могут, это то же самое, просто да, тренироваться надо положение. Только надо им что-то захотеть, и все, да, начать, да. Ну а что скажешь ты? Ладно. Либо мне уже просто, ну короче, не важно. Да, что это, то есть это не тема, когда ты берешь кого-то снисходя и кого-то начинаешь там, или примусом находя, или там всякая. Тема это делать бизнес людям, да, чтобы эти люди делали тебе выручку и себе делали выручку, понимаешь? Что-то создавали, вот как ты говоришь, да. Ну, значит, не вещи создавали, значит, какие-то. Что им никаких ценностей, а почему они нищие тогда? Значит, какие-то ценности им не достает чего-то, значит, если они нищие, значит, что-то, одежды там или что-то там сказал, да. То есть ты какому-то признаку объясняешь, что они, если они нищие, значит, им нужно что-то производить, да, чтобы это обменять на то, чего им не хватает, например, да. Просто, ну, как. Ну, если они нищие, им не хватает на еду, а они еду производить не умеют, они не умеют сделать пачку макарон, не упаковку даже от макарон не могут сделать, ну, там, не знаю, да хватит врать уже, сука, да, понимаю, тут да, то есть ничто они не могут делать, понимаешь? Они могут идти выращивать картошку, вот сейчас они войдут в асфальт, а потом будет мегаполис, ты там что, асфальте будешь выращивать, откуда ты семена возьмешь, там и так далее, да. Ну, например, я тебе просто объясняю, ну, нет, я просто смеялся, что, я не знаю, делал я просто так. Да, то есть понимаешь, что если они нищие, почему-то, потому что я уже банально говорю, там, еды, не знаю, одежды, гаджетов не хватает. Откуда? Они не умеют ни то, ни другое, ни третье производить, и это психиатрично, если они все это начнут делать для себя, да. То есть, да, им надо работать, чтобы обменять результат своего, то есть им надо что-то производить ценное в обществе, но это банальная вещь, ты все знаешь. Я тебе просто говорю, да. И тебе надо в этом процессе получить от них прибыль. Понимаешь? То есть, как бы, да. И это вопрос, как бы, это долгая уже история, да. То есть это, да. Больше нету никаких путей. Потому что, да. Да, все, точка, это изначально. Поэтому я не верю в благотворительность. Все, точка, закрыли вопрос, да. И в мопсов я тоже не верю, да. То есть, благотворительность, она будет, конечно, что она несет такое, да, она о себе так говорит. Он о себе так говорит, потому что, нет, наоборот, потому что благотворительность, она будет она будет вот в этом, нет, типа того, не знаю, мне плевать. То есть, да, но она не будет, потому что она как бы замкнутая, да, типа того, на чем, да. Ну, то есть, чтобы, типа того, да, не знаю, это меня уже не касается, да, то есть, да, то есть, это другой вопрос, что ты их кормишь, чтобы они не причиняли зло в обществе, и даже потенциально там, да, типа того, да, может быть и так даже, да, но ты все равно, если ты мужик, тогда ты их кормишь, но ты понимаешь, что это паразиты, они у тебя отсасывают кровь, не только у тебя, а всего общества, как бы, да. И они не, да, то есть это очень быстро все. Начни кормить бомжей и поймешь, что такое, да. Вот я понял, да. Короче, долгая история, ну вот я понял, да. То есть рано или поздно, ну ты за свой счет корми, это не за абстрактный какой-то. Да, рано или поздно станет вопрос, даже государственный, просто он позже станет вопрос. Какого хера мы делаем, если они автономно, если у них все нормально, блин? И когда вы работать-то начнете, вот я понял. То есть, да, то есть, чтобы они начали, а потом ты понимаешь, что у них там проблемы какие-то еще глубже какие-то, еще что-то, что они, да, что им надо самим себя поднять. Но это долгая история, все равно одно и то же, да. То есть благотворительность как таковая, она, если мужики занимаются, она вот только туда и может выйти, то, что тебе надо с ними бизнес, как бы, ну, туда и целиться надо как-то сразу, да, я не знаю, там макулатура или чем они там занимаются, да. На что они способны, да, понимаешь, что в их интересе, да, а черт их знает, да, ну да, по идее, чтобы у них семьи были, там, семья, напомню, чтобы жена у них начинала размножаться, и тогда нормально у них будет какое-то благословение, у них идет, да, это коитус, он проклят, он запрещен, потому что от него, да, жизнь будет продолжаться из-за него, поэтому он запрещен, без него будет святость. Потому что, да, понимаешь, да. Короче, я тебе объясняю. Здоровье, что самое главное. Да, такое хорошее, да. Так что, интересно, такое прям вообще. Так это все известно. То есть как бы, почему никто про это, ширмыли, да, не понимает только. Никому не выгодно, ну понятно. Ладно, не знаю, ладно, все знают, да.
Realized that I could get the code and animations working together.
Просто все, как бы смерть, по идее все смертью пропахло, да. Ну ладно, просто так. Да, никто, все нормально, можно, короче, что-то я там
create something amazing.
Until
then, I had really just mostly made text-based games, so the idea of adding some interactive visuals was insane. I immediately started to wonder, thinking about all the amazing games that I could make. The first Flash version I tried was Flash MX, and I remember my parents buying me a great book about it. I read the whole thing, cover to cover, and got better and better at writing code and merging it with visuals and animations. This was still back when I was a kid, at around 14, 15, so I had no idea or any thought of turning this into a job. I was just making cool stuff for fun. So I kept doing things over time as my normal life went on, so constantly learning and creating. And in 2008, I randomly came across Mochi ads. This was an API that you could add to Flash in order to play an ad before the start of the game and potentially make some money. This was at the point where I started to think that maybe there was a possibility of making a job out of it. So I went right for it, learned all the basics really quickly, learned all the various websites that existed, and published my first game with the hope of making something out of it. The end result was a game called Freeway. It's a very simple car avoiding game. You have your car that you can move around, the road is infinite in a straight line, there are other cars that can randomly spawn, and there's a score being calculated. So this was the first time that I made something that I could really...
То есть это не тот вариант, да, про который вы говорите. То есть женщина, которая всех кормит там бесплатно, там все это брехня все. Женщина, она пузатая должна дома сидеть с детьми на руках, да, то есть, а это все уже, да, то есть, ну да, то есть, ну, это так оно и есть, работа в обществе, да, то есть, ну вот в этом социуме там, да, понимаю, да. А женщин нет, это все вранье, что там эти дети милосердия, там эти, да, кошки, что там несет, пошли нахер, блин, он врет просто, нет, он тебе про себя говорит, да. Что какие-то сестры милосердия, там это все брехня, то есть это все, да. Это просто трата времени, этого быть не должно, то есть на это нельзя тратить жизнь, свою энергию, да. На семью, на пузатость надо тратить, на детей, которые тебя рвут, которые тебе титьки будут грызть там и так далее, да, что они там делают с ними, да, то есть как бы вот это нормально, и все жизнь так, да. Но это в наилучшем варианте, а так, ну, значит, ну, что теперь? Не знаю даже. А зачем одинокий ты быть? Зачем? Ты что, мужик, что ли? Зачем? Как так получилось? То есть, как бы, что за упрямство такое в характере, да. Ну, придаткнулся, если она понимает себе так. Мне сложно, ну, как бы, понимает она. Но я все понял, да. Это ведьма просто понял это. Да. Не знаю. Надо будет, и все люди сами чувствуют, так скажем. Да. Да. Честно говоря, у них ты смеешься, я даже и дома, я знаешь, сколько лежит? Вообще-то нет, я периодически вижу их. Раз в неделю выхожу на улицу и гулять. Нормально, да, играет, нормально. Нет, это значит слоя, пацаны, съели.
Only call it a game. It had a complete, albeit simple, game design. There were sound effects and music, there were rules for winning and
Я
losing.
ничего не навязываю, просто к тому, что, да, что бесплатно оно все-таки, да. По-любому, никто не рад бесплатно, потому что это, да, зарабатывать надо, да. Понимаю. Это как, да. Нет, я пока, мне надо пока денег.
Player input in order to control the game.
Нет,
So that's how I eventually got started. A very simple, very basic game. But despite being simple, it was still challenging to make since it was my first game. Now, obviously, ads are a notoriously difficult way to make money. Essentially, you need millions of views in order to get a very basic, decent amount. So for that game, it made something like 50 cents in the first few days. That sounds like a meaningless amount, but for me, it meant that I had found a possible path. As long as I got better at making games, then the potential to turn it into a career was right there. I just had to gain more experience and get a lot better. So I just kept at it, making many games one after the other. All of them simple, but all of them from start to finish. I learned how to draw better in Flash and manage the animations. I got better at ActionScript 2 and made more complex games. Later I moved to ActionScript 3, which is pretty similar to C#, so later it helped me quickly get started with Unity. I made driving games, action games, shooting, strategy, puzzle management, and so on. It was all about constant learning and experimentation. So I kept at it and eventually started selling games as sponsorships and making a tiny bit more money as I got better. Over the course of 5 years, I made roughly 35 games and learned a ton. However, it was still nowhere near enough to support a basic life. At its highest, I was making something like $300 a month. Even while living in Portugal, that's still a pretty low wage. However, it was a lot more than the 50 cents that I got for my first game, but again, still not enough. Then in July of 2012, Steam announced Greenlight, and at the time I didn't pay too much attention and just kept making Flash games, but it stayed in the back of my head. So in December of that year, after making a couple more games that still didn't get me minimum wage, I started thinking of making a game to put on Steam. This was also when I started doing my research looking for how I could build a PC desktop game. Flash could technically do it, but it wasn't really ideal. So during my research, that's when I found out about Unity. It ran on C#, which I had used for a bit and was very similar to ActionScript 3. It was capable of making builds for PC, Mac, and Linux. It was used by a large community, and it had a free version. So with all of that, it instantly became my choice. I downloaded Unity, started playing around with it, and found it very capable and pretty easy to use.
Reading is to your mind what exercise is to your body. If you have too much to read and too little time, you buy books and they sit on your shelf, and you want to have laser focus and actually finish these books. That if somebody has decades of experience, they put into a book and you could sit down in a few days and read that book. If that interests you.
Now, before Greenlight, Steam was a very closed-off system. Essentially, you had to know someone and have a top-tier game to be able to even get a chance of getting on Steam. Now, the good thing about that system was if you did get on there, you would essentially have guaranteed success, and all the games on the store had a very high quality bar. The bad thing was that very few people could get in, even if you had a very good game that would be perfect for a tiny niche. So thankfully, with Greenlight, it suddenly became possible to get on Steam, and with all that I learned from making Flash games for 5 years, I grabbed that chance. Again, Flash games were a wonderful learning experience for me, but not really profitable. At its best, I wasn't even getting anywhere near minimum wage. So it was a great learning experience, but in order to make it for free games with ads, you really need millions of players. Whereas with a paid game, you can get by if you just find a niche and make a game specifically for those players. So I thought about what type of game I would like to make that would be played with a mouse and keyboard on a PC desktop. One of the game series that I loved as a kid was SWAT. I loved the tactics and the theme of cops versus robbers, with a focus on trying to arrest people rather than just shoot everyone. So when I thought of making something mouse-based, it immediately came to my mind. The goal was to make a 2D top-down SWAT game where you would control a group of officers and arrest bad guys inside of a house. However, back then I was still very inexperienced. So when making the AI for the SWAT guys to line up behind the door, kick the door, throw a flashbang and enter, that complex scenario made me realize that I still didn't have anywhere near enough knowledge in order to be able to do that just yet. And then I also came across a design problem that I had no idea to solve, which is what led me to change direction. The one thing that I loved most about SWAT games was going non-lethal and getting the bad guys to comply. One of the ways to do that is to shoot them in the leg, and sometimes they would comply after that. However, in a top-down perspective, that's not really a possibility. You can't really aim at different body parts. So the issues with complex AI and the inability to target body parts caused me to reconsider the whole concept. I still really like the top-down perspective, so I wanted to keep that. One of the last Flash games that I did that I really loved was Cobra Team Heart Attack. It was a top-down zombie shooter with lots of polish and lots of effects. So that essentially made me think to switch from a SWAT game to a zombie game. Zombies have much simpler AI, so that part would be solved, and the characters would be completely controlled by the player without